Is a very difficult day, a dark day, for not only Albertans, but I should hope members of Parliament across this country. Like many of my colleagues have said today, when the information came out last Tuesday about the impending cancellation of Keystone XL, even though there's been lots of hints at this happening, that brought reality home. And I could tell you I had a call on Friday from one of my constituents who was amongst the 1,000 workers that were laid off. I had another constituent whose service company, this lost contract, is costing him $100,000 a month. Do you know how many employees that he is now having to lay off? I have had dozens of calls from constituents and their families about the devastating impact this decision is having on their families and my communities. And this is happening in the middle of a pandemic which has already devastated every corner of our economy. To add this onto that has been particularly difficult. And when I answer those phone calls, Mr. Speaker, the response from my constituents is, why isn't anyone fighting for us? And it's easy for colleagues from across the floor from other parties to say, well, we're just going to transition to other jobs. We're going to find them something else to do. What is that job? I've been hearing that from the Prime Minister for 5 years, and we have 200,000 energy workers out of work in Alberta alone. None of them are coming to my office saying, thank goodness I've got this job in a renewable resource industry, because it doesn't exist without massive government subsidies. And we've talked about those 1,000 workers that TC Energy had to lay off on that first day, but this goes way beyond those 1,000 workers. Jack Mintz from the University of Calgary is predicting there will be 3,000 direct jobs lost, 14,000 indirect jobs in Alberta alone. That is not counting Saskatchewan, that is not counting service company jobs or jobs in other industries that would have benefited from this pipeline. That's, again, another hit to Alberta at the worst possible time. And they're asking, why is no one standing up and fighting for us in this government? That's what they want. That's what they deserve. And the impacts of losing this project are not just about Keystone XL. For many Albertans, and I would say many Canadians, this is just the last straw, which has been, a repeated attack on Alberta energy, but also, Mr. Speaker, I would say Canada's economy. There is no question when we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, our country is already in rocky financial footing. Much of that was because of out-of-control Liberal spending before the pandemic. But to come out of the pandemic and get Canada back on its financial feet, you are going to have to look at industries that you can rely on to be revenue generators. There are only a handful of those industries in Canada, and our energy sector is one of them. Not just one of them, but the most important one. The one that creates the most jobs, the one that creates the most revenue for every level of government across this country. But let's back up a little bit before we even talk about Keystone XL. Let's talk about the position that the Liberal government has put this country in when we talk about our energy industry. The second it got into power, it canceled Northern Gateway. It drowned Energy East in a flood of red tape and new regulations that no other infrastructure project had ever had to face before. It purchased the TMX pipeline, which my colleague, the parliamentary secretary, likes to think, well, we've put more money into the energy industry than Harper ever did. Yeah, Harper never had to pay $4.5 billion for a pipeline that the private sector was going to build anyway. And that $4.5 billion, Mr. Speaker, is now likely more than $12.5 billion. Because every delay and every year that project does not continue with construction, it means product isn't moving and it is not generating revenue. So that $4.5 billion investment that the Liberals like to say is now a $12.5 billion white elephant on the backs of Canadian taxpayers. And then we continue to cripple this industry with bad policy like C-69, the no pipelines bill, the tanker ban, a carbon tax that will go to $170 a ton, far beyond what any other country is putting on their economy, putting us further and further behind in terms of not being competitive. And Mr. Speaker, what has this virtue signaling gotten us? Has this earned us any social justice? Has this earned us any support from the activists? Absolutely not. And why are we trying? Because they will never take yes for an answer. Never. We already have the most stringent environmental and human rights standards in the world in Canada's energy sector. That's what we should be talking about. Not phasing out our energy sector, not crippling it with bad policy, just to try to appease someone else that we know will never be appeased. Those goalposts will always move. And President Biden has proven that. Now let's take a look at Keystone specifically, Mr. Speaker. Keystone had put more than $1 billion into renewable energy to power that pipeline. More than $1 billion to ensure that it was emissions neutral. That still wasn't good enough. So it's impossible to go any further. And I know, we've talked a lot about this, Mr. Speaker, that this is an Alberta issue. And there's no question. My Alberta colleagues and Saskatchewan colleagues, this has hit us hard. And it's very frustrating to hear from our colleagues from other parties that, it's just get over it. But this isn't just an Alberta issue, Mr. Speaker. This is a Canadian issue. These projects which have been decimated or canceled, the Tech Frontier mine we've talked about, Warren Buffett has pulled out $4 billion from a Quebec LNG project in Saguenay, that's Quebec. The cancellation of Energy East. The GE factory in Peterborough, Ontario was going to expand, and that expansion was canceled. And they laid off 350 workers in Peterborough. Do you know what that plant was making, Mr. Speaker? It was making turbines for pipelines. So this isn't just an Alberta issue. This is a Canadian issue. This is about our economic and energy sovereignty. And now what's next at stake? This cancellation of Keystone and the lack of fight from the Liberal government has just emboldened these activists. Now next in line is Line 5 that goes from Canada into Michigan. If that pipeline is canceled by Enbridge project, that could cost Sarnia 5,000 to 6,000 jobs and impact the jobs at Ontario oil refineries. So again, this just isn't an Alberta problem, Mr. Speaker. This is a Canadian problem. And I want my colleagues from the other parties from across Canada to understand that. We're not speaking just for our constituents, which are, of course, our #1 priority, but we're also speaking about what's best for Canada. And that's what we're asking this Prime Minister and this government to do, is start standing up for what's best for Canada's energy workers, what's best for our country, not what's best for their global friends, what's best for Canadian prosperity. And this is about prosperity, Mr. Speaker. We are selling our oil at a massive discount to the United States, who sells it on the world market. That is schools, hospitals, bridges, roads, critical social infrastructure that could be built here in Canada, but now is going to be built in the United States. No longer our largest customer, but our largest competitor. But the last thing I want to mention, Mr. Speaker, is there's been lots of discussion about this is about climate change and fighting emissions. You bet it is. And Keystone Pipeline would have been a very important tool to addressing climate change and reducing emissions. Because you know who benefits from the cancellation of Keystone? How about this, Mr. Speaker? I'm going to look at these stats. How about Mexico? $12.3 billion. Saudi Arabia, $11.5 billion. Iraq, $7 billion. Colombia, $6.5 billion. Russia, Venezuela, I could go on. All of these countries are now going to be filling that void that is left by Keystone. What do you think the human rights and environmental standards are of Russia, Venezuela, and Saudi Arabia compared to Canada? If the fight really is about climate change and really is about emissions reductions, then these opponents of Canadian energy and Canadian pipelines would be actually speaking the truth and talking about exactly what we do here in Canada, and we do it better than anybody else in the world, and they should understand that and speak proudly about it, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Questions and comments. Question.